So recapping some of the storylines from the past Japanese Grand Prix. I wanted to revisit them. We talked about these storylines coming out of China in our preview episode for the Japanese Grand Prix. The big question, how will Yuki's first weekend with Red Bull go? Well, little sip of water. My personal opinion, I think it went pretty well. I think Yuki performed pretty solid. I mean, on a day with limited overtakes, seemed to have a car that was starting to work for him. It seemed like he was starting to get a good grasp on the car. It was fairly close to the points. The reports that I heard were, as far as performance is concerned, there were concerns that there was going to be rain during the Japanese Grand Prix. All reports leading up to the Japanese Grand Prix was there was an 80% chance of rain throughout the day, but the timing obviously playing a bit of a factor there, not exactly sure when. So he took a bit of a heavier rear wing, seemed to have impacted his performance in qualifying as well as the race. But the biggest notes for Yuki Tsunoda, besides being out-qualified by Liam Lawson, learning the car, he still showed strong pace next to Max Verstappen during practice sessions. If things had kind of gone a little bit differently during qualifying, if maybe the window had been a little bit differently, maybe the wing was a little bit different, as Yuki Tsunoda gets a little bit more comfortable in this car, maybe he qualifies and gets into Q3. The window of opportunity, the margins are super, super, super thin this year, don't get me wrong, but starting at P15, working way up to P12, is still a very strong performance for Yuki Tsunoda in his very first Grand Prix weekend with the senior Red Bull team. So with all that in mind, I think it's about as good as you could really ask for. The only thing he didn't do at this point this weekend really was score points and be within like 0.3 of Max Verstappen. But heck, even Lando Norris couldn't finish the race within 0.3 of Max Verstappen. So just a couple of notes for him. I mean, just improving on qualifying. He was out qualified by Liam Lawson, but as he learns this car, I think he's going to improve. And he had a strong weekend alongside Max. I think a couple things go a little bit differently, and Yuki Tsunoda is a point-scoring driver, eligible for the driver of the day. Not quite the driver of the day, in my opinion, but still a pretty solid weekend. And this is a really good, if this is the floor for Yuki Tsunoda, if this is the baseline performance that we're going to see from Yuki Tsunoda, I think that as Formula One fans and as enthusiasts and supporters of Yuki Tsunoda, myself, Kevin Walker, and the rest of you guys, the TLPs, who are big fans of Yuki Tsunoda and the fan of him getting this opportunity, I think we're going to be pleasantly surprised throughout the rest of the season. Through one weekend, I think there's already a little bit more hope that Yuki Tsunoda might be the right fit for the Red Bull Racing team than maybe a Liam Lawson, to the chagrin of Liam Lawson. And talking about Liam Lawson in the V car, the question was, will he return to form? In short order, he didn't. It started well. He qualified in P14, but finishing in P17 with another poor weekend, 45 seconds behind Isaac Hadjar, who got his first points of his Formula One career, finishing in P8. A solid day in a team that so far has been littered with strategy errors and mishaps and botch calls when it comes to the strategy. The strategy was there. Now, Lawson stayed out and was on a bit of a different strategy, but when it came to Isaac Hadjar, it worked well. As far as the actual drive from Liam Lawson, it was an okay drive, but not the kind of weekend you need, right? He went backwards. The guy that replaced him went forwards. I understand the machinery is a little bit different. Maybe the Red Bull does actually perform better, but still not a good look to have fallen back from position on a weekend where no one crashed. No one had any major mistakes. No one brought up the yellow flags. No one brought out any red flags. There were no virtual safety cars. A rarity, and it probably will be a rarity in this season with this many rookies. But for Liam Lawson, in a race where nothing went wrong, the only thing you can do is look at yourself and make the determination that, hey, I went wrong. The expectations are still high within this Red Bull Racing family. And Helmut Marko has very much so laid them out. This is a very cutthroat business, and the top brass within Red Bull had displayed that already after two Grand Prix weekends. So, didn't have a great weekend. I personally, I hope he does get his bearings. I think he was mistreated within all of this. I think the the fans around the sport of Formula One, there were a lot of people very loudly rooting against Liam Lawson's success, have continued to cheer loudly at his lack of success so far. But Liam Lawson made it to Formula One for a reason. And I think within the displays of the previous seasons, we've seen that he can be a good driver. He can be aggressive. But right now, I think he just has rattled confidence. I hope he gets his bearings and he can produce soon before the pressure begins to grow again as Red Bull consider different potential prospects, maybe making some other drivers graduate a little bit early. Who knows? But for Liam Lawson, the microscope is still there. And honestly, you just have to do your best to move it off you. Get a couple of solid weekends under your belt. If he can finish P13 or better in this V car, showing the pace that it has right now, knowing that this car can in fact win not win races, but at least score points and move up the constructors. If Liam Lawson can walk out in Bahrain this next weekend, put it up there near Isaac Hadjar, score some points, or at least come close, like P12, P13 finish, that's going to be great for confidence. It's going to be a great spot to build off of moving forward as you get more comfortable getting reacclimated to the V-carb situation. Another question that we had going into the another question we had going into the Japanese Grand Prix weekend. Can McLaren pull further ahead? The expectations were just narrowly missed. A podium lockout behind Max Verstappen is still a fantastic weekend for 8 or 9 other teams on this grid, right? But feels a little bit lackluster. Lando Norris, I detailed a lot of my thoughts within this podcast. Just not quite reaching Max Verstappen's heights in a car that is faster, objectively faster. We know it to be faster. So what's the disconnect? Why couldn't you win this race? If it wasn't like a botched call on strategy, I think it was just a bit of a mental error on Lando Norris's part. The strategy mess up really was not switching the cars. A solid weekend with high standards. When you're fighting and you're coming off of a constructors championship, when you're coming off of a sniff at a drivers championship, if you're a Lando Norris, there are going to be high expectations. They're still leading the constructors by 36 points. Lando Norris is only ahead of Max Verstappen now after this weekend by 1. Max is going to do everything in his power to keep it competitive, to keep it close, to keep Lando Norris under pressure. The questions of can McLaren pull further ahead? Did they pull ahead further this weekend? On paper, yes. They're still further ahead than Mercedes in the constructors. They're still well ahead of Red Bull, and they're definitely ahead of Ferrari when it comes to the constructors fight. But in the feelings of Formula One fans, in the feelings of the spectators, this team still has to work past a couple of mental errors, procedural errors, and maybe solidify themselves in the minds of the fans, in the minds of the viewership, in the minds of the analysts, that this is a team that really is serious. Take them very, very, very seriously. The car's good. The engineering's great. The infrastructure is there. It just comes down to the actual performance on race weekends. And overall, McLaren have the stuff to do it. I think at a certain level, it's about focus and intention and delivering on those expectations. Another question that we had walking into Japan was for Ferrari. Can they pull together a strong weekend was the question. In a nutshell, it was quiet. It was okay. It wasn't anything special. It certainly wasn't anything to write home about if you're a Ferrari fan. It looks like they had a relatively stable weekend. And like many other teams, they also had stable weekends. A P4, P7 finish between Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. I think this was a good reset weekend for them, especially considering the lows that they had coming out of the Chinese Grand Prix. That race being, write it off. It's gone in the rearview mirror, right? With the double DQs, it doesn't really get much lower than that. The performance on track, even a P5, P6, averaged about similar, right? A P4, P7 finish between the best driver lineup on the grid, at least on paper. But it was a good reset weekend. A P4 in the constructors, they repassed Williams, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe they weren't that far back, but Charles Leclerc is in P6 in the Drivers' Championship. Lewis Hamilton in P8 with 15 points. Leclerc with 20. After the Chinese GP, that took a ton of wind out of their sails. So they just needed this badly. They really had some wild swings between Australia to the sprint in China to the end of the race in China. I think this is a good reset. Procedures were done well. Pit stops were done well. The strategy was effective and inoffensive. So Ferrari just needed this weekend. They needed a reset. They needed to get their bearings back underneath them. Fred Vasseur had to, maybe shake some things up a little bit. But as we go into Bahrain, we're still going to have a couple of questions. But I think as far as Ferrari are concerned right now, they're probably the third fastest car, fourth fastest car, depending on who you ask. They're right next to the Red Bull. Max Verstappen is able to elevate that car, as we can see. But as far as the Ferrari is concerned right now, the performance isn't so lackluster. Obviously, you can win with this car. We've seen it be done. However, I think it's just about getting it in the right operating window. Those are the real remaining questions for Ferrari. If we put the car in the right window, if we can get this, if we can increase the downforce, right? If we can get it within the right operating window to give our drivers a good platform to drive on. They won the sprint by 7 seconds in China, but then lost massively before the disqualifications as far as a P5, P6 finish. When you go from the win to the loss to meh, right? There are a lot of questions there. This is a good floor. This is a good spot to build off of a P4, P7. You can answer some questions here. You can start working out kinks. The swings are not going to be as wild and as variable. I think as you go into Bahrain, the expectation really is going to be for Ferrari, just deliver another solid weekend. If you're sniffing a podium, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Excuse me, a little sip of water. And wrapping up Japan, the last question that we had going into the weekend, can Mercedes keep the upward trajectory? And honestly, they looked fine. It was a notable weekend for Kimi Antonelli. I talked extensively about Kimi Antonelli's weekend in the thoughts portion of this episode of the Lap Podcast. Subscribe if you haven't already. Kimi Antonelli setting a pair of Suzuka lap records. He held his own really, really well on a long run strategy to start the Grand Prix. Pulled away from Hamilton, who was chasing behind after overtaking, I believe, Isaac Hadjar for P7. So catching Russell towards the end, I think the margin was less than 2 seconds, probably a little bit. I think it was like close to 1.3 seconds, 1.5 between him and his teammate, his senior teammate. Different strategy. George electing to go in a little bit earlier on the tire strategy to try to cover off the Ferraris. Didn't quite work out that way. But George P5 kind of buoyed behind Leclerc, had a really strong practice weekend up to that point, but nothing to write home about for Mercedes. I think Mercedes are still kind of looking forward to seeing what their next set of upgrades are going to bring them. Overall, it was a fine weekend. It wasn't anything to write home about. Nothing super special. You're not hanging your hat on this one after, 2 consecutive races where you podiumed. Yeah, it was okay. And that's fine. Not everything is going to be stellar this year. The margins are super thin. Max Verstappen was on one this weekend. But you're not looking ahead and trying to find excuses. If you're Mercedes, you're trying to find results. Overall, the results can be there. It just depends on putting it in the right window, similar to Ferrari. But I think Mercedes' floor is higher. That's why they're second place in the constructors at this point. And overall, George is having a very strong season so far. More or less, though, it was okay. The storyline being how much further can they go? We're going to talk more about what can Mercedes do a little bit later in our storylines heading into the Bahrain Grand Prix, which we're going to start now.